Always like for you to hear the stories of people at City Church, the people that you interact with every day or every week. Or you don't always know their stories and how God is pursuing them behind the scenes or has pursued them throughout life. So these videos that we have shot have been a great reminder for me of all the different types of people that God has drawn to City Church and how He's continued to work in their lives throughout life. And that's what grace is all about, is this aggressive pursuit of us. Even when we're running away from God many times. I realize that when I teach a series like Charis and we emphasize grace, that there is this tension in the teaching between grace and the reality that the Bible is filled with thou shalls and thou shalt nots and commands and instructions and principles. I realize there's a tension between when we talk about something being all about grace and the reality of a lot of people would look at Christianity as a very rules-driven religion. And particularly if you read the Old Testament, seems to be a lot of rules-based religion and behavior. And I want to spend some time today as we talk about grace in the book of Exodus in helping us understand that dynamic, because I believe that oftentimes, particularly those outside of the Christian faith, but many times inside of our belief system, that we misunderstand the purposes behind the commands and the rules and the prohibitions and the many things that we find, particularly we've been spending our time in the Old Testament. What are they all about? And I think that we misunderstand the commands in this way. Often people view the rules, and we'll just use that phrase, we talk about the rules as a way to get in, kind of a how to get in. If you abide by these rules, then you get in. Rules keepers are approved, and those who break the rules are not approved. That's kind of how we function, that's kind of how we live life, and that's often how we read the Bible. That obedience gets you in and disobedience keeps you out. And we tend to live life that way. That when I am obedient, that God is pleased. And when I'm disobedient, that God gets angry and is upset with me and withdraws His blessing for me or withdraws His grace for me or loves me a little less. And when I am doing what I should do, then God is more pleased with me and I'm blessed and God is happy, which makes my life happy. And we tend to live life under that kind of umbrella, that framework of obedience pleases God, disobedience makes God angry. And as a result of that, as we've said a few times in our series now, that causes us often to read our Bible morally, that we are reading our Bible kind of looking for heroes to emulate. If you will be like Abraham, or be like Moses, or live purely like Joseph, or follow the example of Elijah. We read our Bibles looking for heroes to emulate. If I could just live my life like this person, or avoid the mistakes that this person made in the Bible. And we tend to read our Bibles with that lens of a moral landscape of this is an example for me to follow or an example for me not to follow. And what we've said throughout this series is that when we dig into the Bible story, that we realize that it's filled with rebels and sinners and outcasts and very, very few, if any, examples to follow. That the story of the Bible is a story of redemption. It's a redemptive tell of this God who pursues those who are undeserving, that the entire biblical story is shaped and molded by grace. That the story of the Bible is a story of God's grace. It is a story of who God is, not necessarily who we are. It's His story. History is His story. It's the story of God. And the story of God pursuing rebels like you and like me, pursuing sinners, aggressively pursuing them. Today we're going to use the book of Exodus as an example of what we've been talking about. The Exodus event, which is chronicled obviously in the second book of the Old Testament, thus its name, the book of Exodus, tells this story of a man named Moses and the people of Israel that he led out of Egypt. And like we often do, we tend to make the book of Exodus and the Exodus event about Moses and the Israelites. We tend to make it a story about cool miracles that God performed, the plagues. We tend to make it about the leadership of Moses. I can't tell you how many times I've read leadership principles from Moses, which, again, is not necessarily a bad thing. It just kind of misses the primary point of the book. Or we tend to make it about this group of desert nomads who are trekking toward the promised land. They're being led by fire and clouds and being fed heavenly bread from heaven, and God supplying food at the right time, and them grumbling against Moses. We tend to make it a story about all of these things when in reality the Exodus story is a story of grace on display. It is God's grace on display. We find grace in the book of Exodus. Let me give you some examples. We find grace in Exodus through the people that God uses. The people that God uses in the book of Exodus. For example, God uses in the Exodus event, and a lot of times we miss this, God uses in the Exodus event a number of women in the Exodus. Now, let me tell you why that's important. In that culture, women were considered inferior. They were oppressed. They were basically viewed as property of owners. Not this kind of husband-wife relationship that we understand today. The Bible's very anti-cultural when it comes to the relationship between men and women of that day. They were inferior, oppressed. They were basically on earth to satisfy men, to make meals, to keep the house. They many times would be kind of forced into prostitution in the name of religion. This is the world in which the book of Exodus was written. And yet in the book of Exodus, God uses a number of women to make the entire event happen. Let me show you a couple of examples. Exodus chapter 1 and verse 8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt. This is an important phrase, who did not know Joseph. If you're a Bible person, you know that Joseph became second in command of the entire land of Egypt and basically preserved the Egyptians from famine that would have destroyed them. He moved his family to the land of Egypt because, hey, he was the number 2 guy. They were able to live a great life there. And then Pharaoh died. And another king, another Pharaoh, came in to rule and reign who did not know Joseph. And suddenly he looks around and he sees these, at that time, millions of Israelites growing, and he says, what are we doing here? These people could turn on us at any time and destroy us. Let's make them slaves. And so that's what he did. You know the story. Pharaoh turned the Israelites into slaves. And they, for 400 years, lived in the land of Egypt as slaves. This Pharaoh who did not know Egypt, who did not know Joseph. As a matter of fact, to halt the birth rate, the aggressive birth rate by which the Israelites were multiplying, Pharaoh ordered this edict. We're going to kill all firstborn males who are Israelites. All firstborn males will die. We're going to halt the birth rate. These Israelites are multiplying like rabbits. We're going to cause that to stop because they're going to outnumber us and take us over. We're going to enslave them and kill all firstborn males. Look at chapter 1, verse 21. Grace shows up. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. In the midst of this instruction, all newborn males will die in Israelite homes. There's a group of midwives who are basically servants who feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. And they said, we're not going to allow this to happen. A group of women whose names we will never know, who will never be highlighted in Scripture outside of this one passing statement, had a deeper fear for God than they did for Pharaoh, and they said, we will not allow this to happen. And they began to protect these children, these newborn males. They began to oppose the king's command. Now, most of us know the story, chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. We're introduced to a woman in the text who says, I do not fear Pharaoh more than I fear God. God has given me this child. I will hide him. I will preserve him. And so she hides her little boy for as long as she possibly can for 3 months, and then we know the story. She began to fear for his life, so she took her young boy and she made this little basket and she sets him afloat in the river, knowing that in that river someone will be able to find her son. And she sends his sister, again, another woman in the text, another young lady, sends his sister to watch over him, to guard him in his little boat. And who shows up? Pharaoh's daughter, another woman in the text. Pharaoh's daughter says, what's that basket? What's that noise? Bring that basket over here, opens it up, and lo and behold, there's a kid. She names the boy Moses, which means to be drawn out of the water. Then she says, how can I ever take care of this child? And there happens to be a sister who says, I can help. And she basically hires Moses' sister. So are you following the pattern here? How God, through the Exodus event, we're using lady after lady after lady, woman after woman. He uses Miriam to help raise Moses. We know the story. You fast forward several years. Moses realizes his true identity. He kills a man. He has to flee Egypt to protect his life. He flees. He runs across the desert. And there on the other side of the desert, he encounters daughters in Midian. He marries one. Her name was Zipporah, an African lady. This weird story happens in Exodus chapter 4 that I don't even really know what was happening. But look at this. We again, this is one of those verses we kind of blow through. Exodus chapter 4, verse 24. At a lodging place on the way to the Lord, let me preface it by saying Moses and Zipporah gave birth to a child. 24, lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. This is Moses. God is looking to take the life of Moses. If we read back in the story, it's because he refused to circumcise his son. 25, then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So she left him alone. It was then that she said, a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision. Weird story, right? God is ready to take the life of his own servant Moses. Zipporah, his wife, his African wife, steps in, saves Moses' life by circumcising their son. And I don't know what your visual here, but throwing it at the feet of Moses, basically saying, I've saved you. I've done what God has asked us to do. Follow the pattern. Midwives, female slaves, daughter of Pharaoh, African wife with a very sharp rock. Time and time and time again, God uses people to speak of his grace, to keep the grace story going. Unexpected people in unexpected places. That's why we don't read the Bible from the standpoint of be like Moses, because interwoven in the Moses story, we will miss the bigger story, which is the story of God's grace. That when Pharaoh said, kill the babies, there was a group of ladies that said, we fear God more than Pharaoh. We will not take the lives of our children. There's a wife who says, I value the life of my son too much. I will hide him for as long as possible. I will put a plan in place where covertly behind the scenes, underneath the bigger story, I will allow his sister to guard him. Pharaoh's daughter steps in when Moses is on the other side of the desert, married to a person that we will never even recognize in the text if we haven't been following the Moses story closely. God uses her to save the life of the person that would one day deliver his people. Unexpected people, unexpected places. Just Moses himself, what an unexpected person. Brought up in Pharaoh's court. If you read the rest of the story, no confidence in his own abilities, tongue-tied, can't speak clearly. He's an insecure murderer hiding on the backside of the desert. And God says, I'll use him to deliver my people. And by the way, Moses, is not going to be just you. I'm going to send along your brother. Your brother who will lead the Israelite people in the desert. He will lead them into idolatry, and 3,000 people will die because of their rebellion. What's the point? The point is the people God uses speaks of his grace time and time and time again. It's not their abilities. It's not their uniqueness. It's not their resume. It's not their look how awesome I am. It's not their capabilities. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite of all of that. We find grace and excellence in the people that God uses again and again and again and again. They're not the people that we would choose. Yet there they are in God's story. We also see grace and exodus in the people that God rescues. The whole story of redemption and the story of the Exodus is the story of God rescuing slaves. People who had been slaves for 400 plus years. The Israelites are losers, if we're being honest. They're a podunk nation of tribes who are bigger than the Egyptians that are holding them captive. And yet they live life oppressed as slaves, being abused. A podunk nation with no abilities, no capabilities on their own. And God says, they are my people. And I will redeem them and I will rescue them. They were people that were shaped by idolatry. I mean, you can't live for 400 years under the polytheistic culture of the Egyptians and not be influenced by that frame of religion. And so we see time and time again the Israelites kind of falling back into this mindset of the culture in which they came from, this culture of this kind of capricious God that if you make him happy, then he'll bless you. If you make him angry, he'll pour his wrath out upon you. These multi-gods, the God of the sun and the moon and the seasons and the good times and the bad times. This is the framework in which these Israelites were living life for 400 years. And God chooses these people and he rescues them and redeems them. Not because of how great they were, not because of how righteous they were, not because they were on their knees begging God to rescue them. It had been 400 years. God rescued them because of who he is. Israel had nothing to offer. And God redeems them. Grace and Exodus in the people that God redeems and rescues. And then we see grace in Exodus in the way that God rescues, don't we? I mean, how did God bring these people out? Plagues and miracles and the Red Sea parting and leading them through the desert and defeating armies that they should have never been able to defeat outside of the God that they serve. The Exodus event speaks time and time again of this compassionate God and this powerful God. These are my people, and I will do what's necessary to redeem and rescue them. I will show my power. We saw in Genesis 1 and 2, the very beginning of the Charis series, this transcendent, all-powerful God that controls creation and speaks things into existence that, if you read the Exodus story, controls the very hearts of humanity. Pharaoh thought he was in control. The text says God controlled the heart of Pharaoh. This all-powerful, transcendent God. And then the same God that we find in Genesis chapter 2 that is intimate and personal, that speaks humanity into existence and breathes his very breath into his lungs. And then he speaks to the Israelites. And notice the phrase that he uses over and over again throughout the text. He says, I am the Lord, what? Your God. I am with you. This was a foreign concept to the Israelites. They had been enslaved to a people group that said that gods are not for you, that gods are removed, that gods are fickle, that gods can't be personal, that if you make a God angry, he'll take your life, he'll take your crops, that if you somehow satisfy this God, maybe he will bless you. This is the culture in which these Israelites have been living for 400 years. And then Moses comes on the scene and he says, this God that will deliver you is Yahweh. It's a personal God. He is the Lord, your God. He is with you. He is close to you. Yes, he's all powerful. Yes, when Moses stands on the banks of the Red Sea and stretches out his staff, that with a spoken word, God can divide the ocean in half. Yes, he is that type of God. But he is a God who is with you, who is your God. He's the opposite of the Egyptian gods. The story of deliverance in the book of Exodus is about a God who has pity on his people, compassion on his people. That's what grace is. It is God aggressively pursuing rebellious people. He pursues them even when they don't deserve it. There's nothing on the Israelites' resume that says God choose us for all these reasons. They were the weakest people group on the planet. And God said, I choose you. I will redeem you and I will rescue you, and the entire world will know who is God. Not based on who Israel is, based on who God is. Let me give you this beautiful picture of grace in the midst of this Exodus event. It's one that we overlook a lot of times. We're kind of going through Exodus or reading it in the Bible storybooks or whatever. I like to call it grace in a tent. Grace found in a tent. How many of you enjoy tent camping? Let me see your hand. You like to go and get in a tent and sleep. How many of you despise tent camping with everything that you are? Okay. How many of you, your version of tent camping involves some type of hotel and bed, and that's your version of camping? I'm right there with you. Maybe a nice RV. Well, a couple of years ago now, one of Zach's friends' dad said to me, hey, I'm going to take my son out. We're going to put everything on a backpack and go whatever seemed like 150 miles into the forest, and we're going to set up a tent and sleep and eat and then come back out the next day. Are you in? What a loaded question. Basically saying, Devin, are you a man or not a man? Are you going to prove to your son that you're a man? Or are you going to stay home and play your silly video games? Well, don't challenge my manhood. Like, oh yeah, we're all in. Let me go home and get out my tent and sleeping bags. Yeah. And so what that means is I went to Academy and started looking for... I borrowed a tent. My parents had given me a tent that weighs at least 1,000 pounds. I didn't feel like that was going to make it on the backpack effectively. And so I borrowed a 2-person tent and realized that my sleeping bag, as tight as I could roll it, still seemed to be larger than me. And so I went to Academy and said, look, I need to find a light sleeping bag that I can carry in on a backpack that already weighs, 350 pounds. So what do you have? Well, here we go. Here's your adult size mummy sleeping bag. I didn't realize till we were at the campsite with the tent set up, unrolling the sleeping bag, trying to get into it that once I got into that sleeping bag, there was no possible way for me to move. It was, I don't know, this wide and about this long. And I kid you not, when I got in it and zipped it up, I could not move my arms. I couldn't roll over. I couldn't do anything. It was like someone had wrapped me up. Now I realize why they called it mummy sleeping bag. It was like someone had wrapped me up like a mummy and then expected me to sleep all night. Well, obviously the only thing I could think about for the entire night is I need to move my arms so desperately, but I can't even breathe, much less it was 12 degrees below zero. And so that was tent camping for me. And Zach and I made it out alive and haven't been back, and I avoid that guy at all costs. Let's see. Asked me to go tent camping again. Seems like every weekend he wants me to go, I have something come up. But that was my experience of tent camping. So I'm not like a huge fan of tent camping. I've been tent camping where the tent was the size of a small apartment, and I'm kind of cool with that. You can bring it all in a truck, back up to the campground. You know, you have electricity, actual food. I'm good with all that. But mummy bags in a tent that you transport into the desert and hope you don't land on a rock while you're sleeping, not my most favorite thing in the world to do. And so when we talk about God dwelling in a tent, it's very grimy and dirty and in some ways uncomfortable. And in the last half of the book of Exodus, the author paints a picture of a tent-dwelling, camping God. Man, like every Southerner should be able to get on board with that, right? Like our God dwelled in a tent. He didn't drive in a truck bigger than the state of Wisconsin to do it. He dwelled in a tent. He's a tent-dwelling God. And we're going to bring this full circle in a moment in the New Testament. So this tent that the Israelites called the tabernacle, the significance of the tabernacle is that it symbolized God's desire to dwell with His people. There's only one problem. God is absolutely holy, and we are absolutely not. We are absolutely unholy. And time again, when the absolute holy and the absolute unholy come together, only one survives, and it's not the impure. The holiness of God is so radiant that it cannot tolerate the impurity of humanity. And oftentimes when God and humanity come together, unless God does something to create a veil between them, the unholy is simply obliterated. No spoken word, no, hey, can I have a say in this? When the impure enters the presence of the holiness of God, God is so holy that the unholy simply disappears. That's a holy God. And yet, God has a desire to dwell with His people. And anytime that we see the holy and the unholy come together and obliteration doesn't happen to the unholy, anytime we survive, that's just pure grace. And in the Exodus event, get this, God can't dwell directly with His people. He's holy and they're sinners. But He desires to be in relationship with them. And so He provides a way in the form of a tent, of a tabernacle. And we don't even have time to do this, but to break down the different levels of the tabernacle, the word holy means to be set apart. And God is set apart in multiple ways in the story of the tabernacle till it breaks down from the outer court to the inner court, and only certain people allowed at each level until we get to the very holy of holies in the tabernacles where God in His absolute holiness would dwell and no human could enter into the holy of holies. But in that tabernacle, in that tent is the representation of the presence of a holy holy God who desires deeply to have relationship with his people and to be in their presence even when he has to remain somewhat removed from them because they are sinners and he is absolutely pure. So, kind of the outline of the last part of the book of Exodus is Exodus chapters 25 through 31 is this tabernacle blueprint. God draws it up for them. Here's how to make it. Here's what the specific instructions are on how to construct it, how to interact with it. It is God's desire to come to us, to have a relationship with us, to dwell in a tent. And so he lays it out in the blueprints. Here's the symbolism. Here's what it looks like. Here's what you're to do. And so those chapters that we like to kind of avoid in the last half of the book of Exodus as we're reading is God's details. And then we get to Exodus 32. So 25 through 31, God's blueprint for the tabernacle, his desire to dwell. And then we have this crazy incident. When we get to Exodus chapter 32, we call it the golden calf incident. If you're a Bible person, you know the story. Moses goes up on the mountain to talk to God, to talk to this holy God. And the Israelites get a little restless. Where is God? Moses is dead. He hasn't come back. And so what do they say to Aaron? Make us a God that we can worship, that we can feel and touch and see. Are you kidding me? Like God just brought them out of Egypt and all they've been through. And Moses is gone for 2 days and they're ready to fall down to a golden calf. Moses is talking to God and pleading on their behalf. And the people are like, Aaron, make us gods. Take us back to Egypt. Hold up. Let's not be too harsh on the Israelites. You know what my tendency is? My tendency is to return to slavery. That I've been set free in Jesus, and yet something goes on in my life and I enter some season of insecurity or some season of sin, and my tendency is to turn back and bend my knee to some golden calf in life. My tendency is to run back to Egypt, just like the Israelites. And check out Aaron's explanation. This has to be like one of the worst explanations in the Old Testament. Moses comes down, he's ticked, throws his 10 commandments down after he's been pleading on behalf. He walks down the mountain and he thinks they're celebrating who God is, and he realizes they're bending over to a golden cow and no Chick-fil-A even involved. It's like bending down to the cow. And so he confronts Aaron about it. And look at Aaron's explanation. 32:21. And Moses said to Aaron, what did this people do to you, that you have brought such a great sin upon them? And Aaron said, let not the anger of my Lord burn hot. Like, don't be ticked, Moses. You know these people, that they are set on evil. It's their fault. We talked about that way back in Genesis, right? For they said to me, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So I said to them, let anyone who have gold take it off. So they gave it to me, and here it is, Moses. I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf. Come on, dude. I mean, at least come up with something that makes sense. Like, I just threw the gold into the fire, and ta-da! Cow comes out. The point is, they're worshiping the golden calf. This is the equivalent. Capture the seriousness of this. This is the equivalent to getting married and committing adultery on your wedding night. God has brought them out of Egypt. He is the one true God. I am with you. I will be with you. Moses has gone for 2 days and they bend their knees to a golden calf. They commit spiritual adultery against God on their wedding night. What will God do? I mean, things have to change. This changes everything. This God who delivered them is being abused. He's being mocked. They're turning their eyes toward a piece of gold in the shape of a cow. I mean, what an insult. What is God going to do? Everything looks different when adultery has taken place. Everything looks different when you've been cheated on. Everything looks different when you have been abused and mocked and your faithfulness has been taken advantage of. What is God going to do? Last 5 chapters of the book of Exodus, 35 through 40. Yahweh, God's personal name, God's intimate name, Yahweh dwells in the tent. What? This doesn't make sense. They've cheated on him. They've been unfaithful to him. God comes down anyway, and he lives among them. He dwells in the tent. Look at chapter 40, verse 34. 40:34. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Here's the holiness-unholiness divide, 35. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses himself could not enter into the presence of the Lord. But the point is, after all that had happened, the glory of the Lord fills the tabernacle. God comes down anyway. God dwells among his people anyway. God, redemptively filled with grace, enters into the tent anyway. Get it? Get the picture. God desires relationship with his people. He sets up a plan in order for him to dwell among them. They, in return, have sex with a neighbor's wife on their wedding night. How does God respond? He comes down and dwells among them. Remember in our belief project, John 1? And the Word was God. It was with God. He was God. He was the creator of all things. This Word. John paints this incredible picture. And then we get to John 1:14. Remember the verse? And the Word became what? Flesh. And the rest of that verse says, in our English translations, dwelled among us. If you go to some of the older translations, like the Old King James, the word came and tabernacled among us. Pitched his tent among us. See the imagery? In the Old Testament, in Exodus, God desires relationship with his people. They commit spiritual adultery against him. His response is that he comes down anyway, and he lives among them, and he dwells among them in his tabernacle. And it's all pointing forward to John chapter 1. The Word was God, the Word is God, and the Word dwells among us, sinful people. He moves into our space, and he tabernacles with us. He dwells with us, among us. It's grace. I wish I had time to explore the depth of the tabernacle with you. What we're really seeing happen is the Garden of Eden being reconstructed. God creates and he establishes relationship with humanity, and we choose sin. And God comes down. Remember, we saw it in Genesis 3. God seeks them out. God comes down anyway and seeks us out because his story is shaped by grace. And the symbolism of the tabernacle is only used in two places in the Old Testament. It's used in Exodus and then in Numbers, where the details of the tabernacle are being given, and in Genesis, the first part of Genesis. And the symbolism, the design of it, and the symbolism involved with the angels and how they're to be positioned, it pushes us back to one place. It pushes us back to the Garden of Eden. And so what's happening is, where grace is found, is that God is constantly seeking to restore Eden. And what Eden represents is this pure relationship between God and his creation, that God is constantly pursuing relationship with his creation. When they've sinned against him, he comes down and walks in the garden and seeks them out. When they rebel in the desert and they say, make us a golden calf to bend our knee to, God comes and tabernacles among them. And John 1, when the Word becomes flesh and dwells among us and tabernacles among us, God constantly, again and again, is pursuing relationship, harmony between the Creator and his creation, between the created order. He's constantly pushing us back to the Garden of Eden, recreating even the language that one day God will recreate, that God will have a new heaven and a new earth. What will it look like? Well, most believe it'll look a lot like Eden, that God is seeking to constantly rebuild, reconstruct, redeem, push us back toward Eden. So get this. We got to bring this full circle. Our pursuit of God is not the measuring stick of grace. The measuring stick of grace is God's pursuit of us. You know what that means? That means you're going to go through seasons of rebellion. And you're going to go through times of apathy. And you're going to go through times in life where you feel very disengaged from God. But what I want you to know is that God is never apathetic towards you. And God is never unengaged towards you. That when you are rebellious and apathetic and feel distant from God, that he is never that way toward you. That he is pursuing you and seeking. And we can only understand properly the rules and the commands in the context of God's pursuit. And this is where I want to bring it full circle to how we started. Relationship precedes rules. Don't miss that. It's important when you're understanding the commands of the Old Testament, thou shalt nots. Relationship always precedes rules, because the rules are not about getting in. The rules are about those who are already in. Because rules without relationship always leads to rebellion. You set rules in place and there's no relationship, the end result of that will always be rebellion. That's why it doesn't matter how many rules you put in place with your kids. If you don't have a relationship with them, the rules are going to push them toward rebellion. If they know you love them unconditionally, if they know you care about them, you want what's best for them, your deepest desire is what's best for them, the rules, even though they'll be broken at times, they look different. Rules precede, or relationship precedes rules. The rules, get this, the rules came after God's election, after God's deliverance. The rules were not about the eternal status of the Israelites. The rules were not about, all right, if you keep these rules, you're going to make it to heaven. It was not an eternity issue. The rules were about the behavior pattern of slaves. Slaves with no government. Slaves with no leader who were suddenly wandering through the desert. Slaves with no possession of organized government in any way. Their only possession was the one and only God. And God says, here's my laws. You want to know what it looks like to live like God's people in your culture? Here's the laws. You've been in 400 years of Egyptian slavery and influence, and now I am the Lord your God. I'm your God. And here's what that looks like. Let's think about the Big Ten. The Big Ten Commandments. I mean, people always go, there's 650 plus commands, but we tend to think about the Big Ten. So let's just look at command number 1, which is interesting. Most people think, if I keep the 10 commandments, then everything's going to be okay. Very few people can actually name all 10 commandments or even understand what they are. But the very first one, this is the only one we've got time to look at. And God spoke all of these words saying, here it is, relationship, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. There's the relationship. I chose you. I redeemed you. I delivered you. I'm your God. I'm not an Egyptian God. It's capricious and fickle and on today, off tomorrow, love you, hate you. I'm your God. I brought you out of Egypt. I delivered you. Here's the first command. You shall have no other gods before me. No other gods besides me, it's often translated. And this first command sets the tone for all the others, all 600 plus commands. What is this first one about? This first one is God saying, I'm your God. I'm your one and only God. I am all you need. You don't need anything else. You don't need another God. I'm your God. I can be trusted. There's no God beside me. I'm yours. A relationship with God is grounded in trust. What is the point of the commands? Just the 10 commands. The point of even the Big Ten is that my relationship with God impacts everything. And so God, in the first 4, he says, look, I'm your God. I'm all you need. And I won't be manipulated. You can read through the first 4. This is basically what God's saying. I'm not going to be manipulated. I'm not going to be invoked for your own self-interest. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. That's not God saying, don't say GD, even though that is implied. What God's really saying about not taking the name of the Lord your God in vain is, I'm not a magic genie in a bottle that you can just call on when you need. I won't be invoked for your own purposes. I'm bigger than that. I'm the God. Honor me. Honor me. I won't be invoked. I won't be controlled. I won't be ignored. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Don't ignore me. Don't manipulate me. I am the Lord your God. And he talks about this vertical relationship, and then he goes horizontal on us. And if you get this right, if you realize I am your God, I can be trusted, I won't be manipulated, I won't be controlled, I won't be invoked for your own status, I need to be honored and worshiped. If you get that, then you'll treat other people fairly. You won't lie. You won't take your neighbor's wife. You won't steal from other people. We are God's people. He is all we need. He can be trusted. And that's why I tell you, and I've told you before, every sin is ultimately an idolatry issue. It's a sin of the heart. It's kneeling my knee to some other God besides the God. It's my failure to trust God in that moment. Sex outside of God's boundaries? Failure to trust God in that moment, that He is more than enough for me. Lying, cheating, stealing, failure to trust God in that moment, that He is more than enough for me. Doubt, fears, failure to trust God in that moment, that He is more than enough for me. Listen to me. God's love for me is not dictated by my obedience. My disobedience will hinder that relationship, won't it? There's consequences, there's messiness when disobedience happens, but His love is not dictated by my obedience. He's already called me out. He brought me out of Egypt. I'm your God. I can be trusted. Obedience does not determine ownership. Do you hear me? Our obedience does not determine ownership. I am the Lord your God, he says. I own you. I'm out of time. Let me illustrate it this way. When we bought our dog, Toby, we own him. We purchased him. When we brought him home, there was a process to teach him. This is our yard. You stay in our yard. You live in our yard. That yard is not your yard. That yard is not your yard. That yard is not your yard. This is your yard. You live in this yard. When you're outside, you stay in this yard. Okay? There's invisible fences and all that to help ultimately teach those rules if you need those things. We don't have that, and about 95% of the time, Toby does good with the rules. 5% of the time, he's hanging out at the neighbor's house outside of the rules. My ownership of Toby doesn't hinge on his obedience. I own him if he's in my yard or my neighbor's yard. The flip side of that is, I don't go through the neighborhood and look for other dogs and bring them and put them in my yard and say, all right, he's mine. Look, he's in my yard. These are my rules. He's living by my rules. He must be my dog. My neighbor would be like, I don't care whose yard he's in. He's my dog. I own him. Doesn't matter what rules he's abiding by. I own the dog. Toby is our dog. It doesn't matter if he's in my yard, neighbor's yard, wherever he's at. I own him. Now, obviously, when he's abiding by the rules and staying in his own yard, it's a happier life for him. But my ownership of him is not dictated by where he is. Are you tracking me? We have been bought with a price. We belong to him. We are his. Our obedience does not dictate his ownership of us. So what is the purpose of the law? The law confirms an existing relationship. I belong to him. I belong to him. He has set me free from sin. Law is an expression of grace because law continually exposes my need for grace. Law continually says, Devin, here's the standard, and guess what? You don't measure up to it. But there's someone who does. Trust him. He's what you need. How would you answer this question? If I were to sit you down and say, how are you doing spiritually? You would probably start listing off a bunch of spiritual activities. Well, I prayed, I read my Bible, I go to church, I try to live clean. You would link your spiritual activity to your spirituality. Is that important? It's absolutely important, but the focus is in the wrong place. The focus is on who? It's on me. My spirituality is dictated by God who owns me. Grace means that my spirituality is upheld and grows because of God's stubborn delight in me and pursuit of me. That God is constantly, actively working in me. And when we meet grace, when we get grace, when we understand grace, when we live grace, then guess what happens? I obey. Obedience is the natural overflow of getting grace, of understanding it, of understanding He is all I need. He can be trusted. Live like it. I don't have to go back to the golden calf. I don't have to go back to Egypt. I don't have to become a slave to sin. He set me free from it. If I live in His grace, I don't desire those things. I desire to know Him deeper, to love Him more. Why? He is the Lord my God. There's no one beside Him. He is all I need. and He can be trusted. And guess what? When I find myself back in Egypt, when I find myself kneeling again at the golden calf time and time and time again, when I find myself saying, man, that cheeseburger in Egypt was awesome. This manna sucks. This cheeseburger in Egypt, hook me up with that, right? When I find myself back in this world, guess what? He doesn't give up. He doesn't stop. When I commit spiritual adultery against Him, He says, I'll dwell in the tent. I desire a relationship with you. I'll do what's necessary. I have done what's necessary to establish it. I am the Lord your God. I can be trusted. And He'll pursue me. And He'll pick me back up. And He'll redeem me. And restore me and push me back toward Eden again and again and again. You know why? Because He's a God of grace. And He can be trusted.